Okay. Well, thanks, Rob. Yeah. And I appreciate this opportunity. My background, 35 years in the U.S. Army, completed my service in 2013. I was an infantry officer, ground combat guy in the U.S. Army. And among my duties, I had command of troops as a general in Iraq twice, and then in Afghanistan once. And among my duties, I commanded the 1st Cavalry Division. Most people that have ever heard of it have heard about it from Vietnam War movies like Apocalypse Now and We Were Soldiers, a very famous unit. And I was very fortunate to get to command that one in Baghdad, Iraq, as well as other duties. But and then currently I teach history at North Carolina State University, and that's really interesting. Students are great there, and as you all are well aware, in this part of the state, North Carolina State University is a tremendous STEM school. So most of my students are not historians or political scientists or anything. They're future engineers, they're future microbiologists and all that, or ag folks, business people, and they're trying to figure out how is history, let alone military history, relevant to their life. So that's one of the things I try to sort of help them with.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, sir. And one of the things, like, if you're sitting there right now listening to this intro and you're going like, why did I need to listen to this? Because if you think about a lot of the breakthroughs that we have, modern technology, a lot of it started in the military first. So you think about the microwave, the radar, cell phone. Unfortunately for Al Gore, it was not him that invented the internet, but it was, the requirements of the military industrial complex. And I think all of those things are very, very important. And if you're trying to fact check me, internet was a DARPA initiative, but we'll continue on from there. Anyway.
That's Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, 1969, you're right on target.
And so by understanding that, how all those things kind of trickled out of the military industrial complex into the commercial space. And now, as we look at today's modern society, there's a lot more technology that's coming from the commercial space that's going into the military industrial complex. One, because we haven't had a major full-scale war that has required the entire country to mobilize and support the war effort. So now commercially you can do a lot more and in development at a faster pace than the military is doing, just because the military is kind of stuck in some innovation loopholes. And so this kind of leads into my first question. And this was one of the things that, my deputy and I used to talk about all the time when we were sitting down at Green Ramp waiting to jump, is there's a difference between an evolution and a revolution. And I say that because, you have bows and arrows to hypersonic weapons. But guess what? At the end of the day, it is a projectile traveling a distance to strike a target. Do you think there's any specific revolution in the history of warfare that significantly changed how warfare has been fought, past, present, or future, sir?
Yeah, there certainly is. And the revolutions are not always technological. We certainly know political revolutions. The American Revolution had a huge impact on the world in terms of showing that a country did not have to be run by a hereditary king and queen and nobles and all that kind of stuff. And that changed the structure of society, changed the structures of the military as well. And the French took that and ran with it in their revolution in 1789 and on and on. But in the technology realm, most of the stuff, I think, Rob, you hit a key term there. Most of the stuff's evolutionary. In other words, we have an M1 Garand rifle in World War II, and we have an M14 by the Cold War, and we have an M16 by Vietnam, and we have an M4 carbine now, and we're going to a new generation. But you and I could look at those and say, hey, those are all kind of related. In other words, they look like they're from the same family of stuff, and they are. Revolutions are much more rare. They get a lot of interest, and a couple military revolutions, if you think about it, that would jump right out at us. One was the wide-scale introduction of gunpowder and weapons built around gunpowder. Initial use of gunpowder, was a chemical, so the first use of it by the Chinese and the Mongols and others who got it was to blow holes in walls during sieges. It was always hard to get a hole in the wall, and the battering ram, the catapult throwing rocks, all that. And they found this stuff that blew up, and they said, hey, this is really good. Shove this under the wall. And so the first use of it was that. And then eventually, like you said, projectile weapons. And, hey, well, if it can blow a hole in the wall, maybe it can shoot this arrow out of this tube. And then they said, well, an arrow's not as good. How about a ball? Well, a ball's not as good. How about a cone? All that kind of stuff. So gunpowder, a huge change. But that revolution in warfare took a couple hundred years to spread across the world. I mean, one of the reasons, a lot of things cause this, but one of the reasons why when Europeans pop into the what they call the New World, the Western Hemisphere, our part of the world, and they run into very fierce opponents like the Aztec and the Inca, one of the reasons they're able to overcome them is the Aztec and the Inca had not gotten gunpowder yet. And so the European guys, it's like Martians with ray guns descending on, the Civil War or something in America. It's a wipeout. And so you do get that occasionally where certain technologies are just, they leap ahead, wholesale change. Another one that I'd put in that same category is light speed communications. We don't often think, when we mess with our phones and stuff, we forget these things are operating pretty much at the speed of light. I mean, that zing, 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 that's how fast those electrons are going. And the first version of this, an American dude with a wire, Samuel Morse, figures out the telegraph. And you'd say, well, telegraph, that's not a weapon. How do you kill a person with a telegraph? With the telegraph, you can suddenly begin to move forces very quickly. Before that was invented, the only way to get a message to a ship, you had to send another ship out there, or maybe come up and run up some signal flags. You had to get within visual range. On land, you had to send a guy on a horse. And so, I mean, huge changes. And again, all the way through revolution. And then finally, the big one that's worrying us right now, and may segue into another part of the conversation, old Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, formerly the KGB, now the head of the Russian Federation, he's been yapping lately about nuclear weapons. The introduction of nuclear weapons into combat is one of the reasons we have not had major state-to-state sort of world wars since 1945. We've had threats of them. We certainly had lesser wars, Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan and Korea and all that. But we haven't had the big one because of that, because they were so destructive. The fear was, if you start using these weapons, you're going to kill millions and millions of people, and hopefully Putin won't get his chance to do that.
Yes, sir. And I think, for those of you guys that are history buffs, look up the Pentampic Brigade. I can't pronounce it correctly, but they used to have
the Pentampic,
the Pentampic Brigade. Yeah. So that was one of the things that was the early onset of hey, we're going to use tactical nukes in warfare. And again, over time, agreements came into place. And that's one of the things is the easiest way to explain it is watch the movie War Games. Mutually assured destruction kind of
exactly right. The old Matthew Broderick Ali Sheedy movie.
Yeah. So mutually assured destruction kind of took the nukes off the table, and it literally took a movie like War Games to kind of explain that to everyone. And so if you're a young kid, if you're an 80s baby, then you probably need to go back and watch that just to have a better understanding. If you're a 90s baby, you need to watch it for sure. But that is kind of the reason why we don't see nukes in a wide scale opportunity as it is. I would say now, the biggest threat outside of somebody using a nuke would be in space or cyberspace. And we'll get to that a little bit later.
Absolutely. But, and those are strong now because that one area is blocked off. And the nature of competition, and I don't care if it's business, sports, politics, or war, if one area is blocked, you're going to find a way around.
That's right. You always try and find the path of least resistance and the greatest success. But speaking of what you previously mentioned about ongoing situation internationally in the Ukraine, the amount of support that Ukraine is receiving internationally is huge. I mean, I have yet to see an outcry for a country that's that small. Maybe exception with the Kurds in the early 90s, where people have kind of stepped up and wanted to help them out in a significant way. But would you consider the ongoing actions a proxy war or just an incursion of a bad neighbor? Because I think, we've seen it kind of both ways. So from the incursion part of it, we've seen Iraq go into Kuwait, and that started Desert Storm. We fought a pretty large scale military operation to depose, the Iraqis from Kuwait. Fast forward almost 20 years, almost 30 years now, and you're looking at a similar situation, but culturally, when you look at Russia and Ukraine, they're a lot culturally closer than Iraq and Kuwait were. So is it really, just a bad neighbor acting crazy, or is it a legitimate proxy war, which is, the traditional special forces UW mission or unconventional warfare mission that we normally encounter in dealing with special operations. But what are your thoughts on this, sir? Because I'd really like to hear your perspective.
I'll give the classic I teach at a college guy answer, which is both are right. From the Russian perspective or the Ukrainian perspective, it's bad neighbor. It's two countries fighting, territorial expansion, all that. There's long history between these guys. The Russian state that we know of, although the capital now is in Moscow, the original capital was in Kiev back in 882 when the state was founded. And so, for people from that part of the world, Ukraine is not seen as independent. It's seen as the centerpiece of that whole cultural thing that we think of as Russian. And the Ukrainians, Ukraine, you mentioned, Kuwait is not a very large country, Iraq a much larger country than invaded it. But Ukraine is actually the second largest country in Europe. Russia's humongous, 11 time zones. I mean, the sun's going down at one end and is coming up at the other, the largest country in the world. But Ukraine's the second largest. And so these guys, border disputes have been long told. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire for centuries. It was briefly independent at the end of World War I, and then the new Soviet government took them back in. Stalin killed millions there to get them to heal during the communist phase. So there's no love lost between Ukrainians and Muscovite Russians. It's a shotgun marriage at best. And so when you get this invasion, and remember, this invasion actually started in the late winter, early spring of 2014. That's where the first Russian forces moved into the Crimea in eastern Ukraine, and then escalated greatly this February. But you also use an interesting term, Rob. You said proxy war. Ukraine by itself does not have enough population, arms industry, or equipment and force on hand to defend itself. If all they could work with was what existed within the borders of Ukraine, they would be a wholly owned subsidiary of VV Putin's Russia right now. But the United States, other countries around the world rallied. The NATO alliance was big in this because, of course, Russia shares a border with NATO countries and an even bigger border now that Finland's in, as well as Sweden. But the Finns do share a direct border. The Swedes are in the neighborhood up there in the Baltic Sea. But it's really NATO, led by the United States, that has kept the Ukrainians afloat. If we just did the number crunching, the Russians would overrun them and the Ukrainians would be done by now. But it's keeping them afloat. They're fighting hard, no doubt about that. One other thing I should mention is that the war between Ukraine and Russia has some similarities to a 1980s war that happened between two countries you've mentioned, Iraq and Iran. In both cases, the most modern technology, the most modern tactics are being used. But to us, as an outsider, when we look at the map, it's like World War I. It moves 100 yards this way or that way, over a week. And it's a reminder to us of how lethal and deadly and potentially indecisive is a big force-on-force conventional operation. If you go at them, your strength on their strength, this is what you get. You get this grinding war of attrition like we saw in World War I and even some of the theaters in World War II. So it shouldn't surprise us, but that's where we're at now. And in terms of proxy, the Ukrainians don't consider themselves our proxy, but they're certainly a force that we and our allies in NATO and around the world are trying to help. Send them gear, send them money, send them whatever they can. And this winter, they're going to need food as well as fuel, because the Russians used to supply a lot of that. And of course, that's not coming from them anymore.
Yeah, I think enabling operations is probably the correct term. But
you used the right term. That's a good military doctrinal word. But I agree with you. That's well said.
And I think and that's the scary part. And so as you mentioned, technology to technology, head to head is very, very dangerous. And part of my transition in the Army before I retired was, again, I went from being an infantry officer for 20 years, and then I did my last 3 years as an electronic warfare guy. And looking at the cone of space and cyberspace, how important they are. They're so important to the fact that, like, we added an additional branch to the Army. We've added an additional force to the Department of Defense. So both of which are important, but which one of those two are the most or the next high threat domain of warfare? Is it space or is it cyberspace? Are they mutually exclusive or are they mutually supporting? Because I think there's a little bit of both. And like, I have my thoughts, but again, I'd like to get your opinion and your insights on this too, sir.
Well, when you talk space and cyberspace, they're closely integrated. You know, a funny thing happened in the space race in the 1960s, and I'm a little older than you, so I actually remember seeing all this junk. I can actually remember when they shot John Glenn into orbit and all that, and the Russians were always ahead of us at the beginning of it with their satellites and their people and all that. But the funny thing that happened is everybody, when they thought, they thought the space race was about rockets and going to the moon and going to Mars and space. Yeah, that's all part of it. What they missed was the real space race was about shrinking stuff down because it's so expensive to shoot things off through the gravity well of Earth. And space actually accelerated the cyber revolution already underway. The early versions of cyber were already in place by World War II. But space really accelerated, and the United States had a big advantage in that. The Soviets were great at rocket stuff. They actually had stronger rockets than us, bigger, more powerful, more reliable rockets than us at the start of the space race. But for ideological reasons, they could not allow the exchange of data unregulated by the KGB. They were so worried that two guys in a hut in Omsk would start discussing how to get rid of the government in Moscow. So, unless you could like shrink down a KGB officer and stick him on every microchip, they weren't going to permit that. And so the Soviets always lagged way behind in, they steal stuff from us. There are stories, and these aren't made up. These are true. The old Toys R Us franchise. KGB and Russian military intelligence, GRU officers in the Washington suburbs will be scouring the shelves of Toys R Us and stuff in the 1980s, picking up all the new Sega consoles, and they'd strip out the computer chips and send them back to Moscow. I mean, again, to us, we would say, man, how can you be that backward? But the point of that whole little vignette is cyber and space have always been tied from the very beginning. They're still tied. And right now, people worry about, somebody's going to use an anti-satellite weapon and take out our global positioning satellites, and all our GPS and our smartphones won't work, our maps and stuff. Far more likely is a bunch of ones and zeros are going to take that out. And the hardware will still be floating around in orbit doing its thing, but it won't work. It'll be a flying brick. That's the hazard. And cyber is particularly dangerous because the same thing that makes us very, very innovative, our exchange of information, our sharing of information, also means we are wide open. And I know everybody has their McAfee and Norton utility, all that stuff. Great. I might add that, of course, if you're not aware of it, I think most people should be. You have Jenny Kaspersky got his training in the KGB. So, the Kaspersky system that's used through much of the world is actually, if you read the fine print, supplies all that information back to the Russian Federation. He didn't forget who paid for his education. But leaving that aside, the point is, cyber is a huge vulnerability. And Rob, you hit a really important thing there when you said we formed new cyber branches in our military. We've got new cyber units. We've got a new space force. We've got all those things. But my experience, for what it's worth, I'm like you were raised, I'm an infantry guy. What makes things work is combined arms within the service, joint within the services together, interagency within the whole U.S. government, coalition, our allies and stuff. And my worry is right now, we're putting cyber and space into little silos. And we're saying, we got a space force. That space is taken care of. We've organized a cyber branch. They're handling all the cyber stuff. Look, it's just like in warfare. You can't, you don't have a medic branch and they're the only people who ever do first aid. Everybody's got to do some first aid.
Yes, sir.
Every single service has aviation capabilities of some type. Every single service has communication capabilities. Every single unit has mechanic capabilities. So one of the things we cannot afford to do, since cyber and space are so important, is outsource them to independent entities. Integration and combined arms is the way to go. And so I'd rather see that. I'd rather see space and cyber people integrated into our units rather than separated. Again, I may be wrong, but generally the thrust of what's happened throughout history sort of shows you it's integrating the new technology rather than putting it in its own box that works.
No, sir, I 100% agree. And again, for those of you guys that are young, look up Goldwater Nichols for this older folks, we understand that, the establishment of the Joint Operating Force after the Goldwater-Nichols Acts is actually one of the most successful bills that has ever been passed, because it forces us to work together. And one of the things that we've always talked about, and we say it all the time, it's like, hey, you're going to be purple from here on out. Like, you're never going to operate as just the Army or just the Navy or just the Marines. And the reason why I say that is because now all those technological support, like you mentioned, sir, particularly in space and cyberspace, like there is no, Marine satellite. There is no Army satellite that's doing GPS. It's just a satellite that is providing that service. And so understanding that all these things are interrelated, and as an operations person or somebody that's going to be on the ground in the fight, you want to know all the tools that are available to you, so you have the best opportunity to utilize those tools at the point of friction. And so understanding that, and like we've kind of walked you through this in our discussion here, but like, hey, look, what revolutions of technology have happened? Why is it important? Because like, hey, look, we're providing support to Ukraine, whether that be financially or material. And then, hey, guess what? Space and cyberspace is playing in this as well. So if you look at the Ukraine conflict, like Russian generals are getting killed in droves. Well, that's probably because there's some space or cyberspace assets that are helping to target those guys, whether it be terrestrial, whether it be space-based, whether it be from somewhere else. They're targeting individuals and they're, killing these guys on the battlefield. And it's because they're mutually supporting. So understanding how to pull this thread into, something cohesive. And yes, there's always going to be agreements and disagreements. There's always a tear line. There's probably more information that you can find out if you're behind the green door inside the skiff somewhere. However, when you look at it just on the face, it literally is being able to utilize technology to get it to the point of friction as quickly as possible and maintain your force. And it's about lethality and survivability. And that has been to the Ukrainians' benefit up to this point, that they've been lethal and they've been able to survive. And so long as they can do that, that helps. And I think that's a lesson for everybody in the military too, because, I always say this, it's like the reason why the Red Dawn scenario never happened in the 80s or 90s in the military is because we got guns all over this country. Right? If you live in Texas, they sell 3 million guns. They have 1.5, on average per year concealed carry permit. So if I go mess around in Texas, it's probably not going to end well for me. Right? And that is really how we all should be internationally. And it goes back to the nuke conversation as well, is like the more deterrence that you have in the force of arms, the least likely that you're going to have to use it. And that's the real lesson here. It's like, look, the toughest person in the room isn't the guy that has a gun or a knife. It's a guy that knows he has a gun and a knife and he chooses not to use it. And so understanding that, and like for the longest time as the United States, we've controlled the monopoly on violence. If we wanted to go do something, we could do it. Now we have peer competitors. So we are trying to accelerate what we can, increase our innovation to not just keep pace with the enemy. And I hear people say that all the time, like, oh, China, Russia, and North Korea are the pacing threats. Like, no, we don't want to be the pacing threats. We want to surpass them. Again, because we want to maintain that technological advantage. Because when you look at the history of warfare and what we can do as a country, I have no doubt in my mind that if I were to go down to Fort Bragg and talk to a PFC in 2nd of 325, that kid is chomping at the bit and ready to go if the balloon goes up to fight a war. The difficulty that soldier will have is what space, cyber, air defense, all those other layers of things that are mutually supporting are going to prevent him from getting to the objective that the Army or the nation requires him to go to. And so that's really, understanding the calculus of the battlefield is how we get the most talented soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines into a country to defend our nation abroad rather than at home. And if we lose sight of that, whether that be as a technologist, whether that be as just a citizen or a veteran, then we're not doing them a service. And that's part of the reason why we got you on here today, sir, is just to have a conversation about technology and the evolution of it and how to better inform the folks in our ecosystem so they have a better understanding of like, hey, look, just because you don't want to be the technologist, you may have something that could save somebody's life. And if you're the type of person that's like, well, I don't want to support the war. Okay, well, don't worry about supporting the war. Worry about supporting the soldier to keep him alive, preserve that national treasure that is the human being that is attached to that service, right? I don't care, male, female, black, white, whatever. If we can preserve our national treasures, which is the human capital that we have, then we're much better off than we are wasting it fighting somewhere and our soldiers are less prepared. But I will give you the last word, sir. So if you have anything else that you want to talk about, I will give it to you, and then we'll wrap this thing up.
I think you really said it well there, Rob, in your comments, and that is, the first president we ever had, who was a pretty good general during our revolution, George Washington. I mean, his among many thoughts that he left us as he served and left the office of president was that if you want to avoid war, prepare. Basically, the way to not fight wars is to be prepared to fight them, and that's always our preference. Like you said, deter the enemy, and then you don't have to defeat or kill them. And you're exactly right. There's so many technologies, ideas, methods, services that people are doing every single day that they think to themselves, well, this has nothing to do with war. And yet it has everything to do with preserving lives and helping people in ways you may not even be thinking about. And you started off with a reminder that the flow is two ways. Things that are tried on the battlefield, the global positioning system, for example, that we use every day to find our way from point A to point B, originally designed by the military and intelligence services for targeting. And now it targets us as we move around and go places to get our daily lives done. So it's important. And like old George Washington said, the best way to avoid fighting wars is to be prepared. And the best way to be prepared, in my view, is to harness the full capabilities of the American society. And that certainly includes our technology and our private industry.
Yes. All right, sir. Those are great words. I really appreciate your time today. This was awesome. Like I love enriching conversations and having discussions with people that care, whether it be about history, whether it be about the military, whether it be about technology, or all three of those things. I think it's very important to have that understanding, and it's very, very cliche, but, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But as a society today, we are watching history play out in front of us. And if you're not paying attention to what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on internationally, I would encourage you to, take a look at some of the resources. There's tons of resources out there. If you really want to learn the world, go to the CIA Factbook webpage. It's unclassified. Pick a country and read up on it, because you might find something interesting, and that constant pursuit of education and learning is critical to success, not only for yourself as an individual, but for the society and the community as well. So I will end it right now, but I will also say I really, really appreciate your time today.